And today what I want us to see is not just work, but the opposite of the coin. I want us to see rest. And God gives all of us a season for work and a season for rest. In fact, from Ecclesiastes chapter 3 today, there's a season for absolutely everything that happens to you in life. And every season of life, good or bad, God uses it for His glory. Listen to this. For His glory and for your ultimate good. So do you recognize the name David Livingstone? Most people, if you've been in church before, you've heard this name before. Livingstone lived in the early 1800s. He was born in Scotland. He became a medical doctor, but he really had this passion to follow Jesus Christ. At a young age, Livingstone was heavily influenced by his father and by an evangelist in his town by the name of David Hogg. As a young man, Livingstone gave his life to Jesus Christ. And then he felt compelled to serve Jesus in the form of missions. Now, Livingstone was not just a medical doctor. He was a scientist. He was a medical missionary. He was one of the first men to campaign to end slavery. And he was also one of the guys who was very outspoken about developing the continent of Africa so that the people that lived there could have their own economic resources. Basically, so that they would have a better way of living. Don't just take from them and give them nothing in return. You may be aware that Livingstone traveled thousands of miles on foot, carrying all that he owned on his back. In fact, he was one of the first people ever that was born outside the continent of Africa to literally walk from one side of the continent to the other side, from one coast to the other on foot. Livingstone traveled thousands of miles, became a world-known medical missionary. And in 1873, David Livingstone died in his tent in what we would call today Zimbabwe. When the natives that were traveling along with him found Livingstone, he was in his tent and he was on his knees in prayer when he died. He kept a journal, and one of the statements that he wrote in this journal, God really used to impact me. Livingstone made this statement: without Christ, not one more step. The man who covered thousands of miles on foot said, if Jesus Christ isn't with me, if He doesn't go before me, if He doesn't go with me, I won't travel one more step. I'll stay right where I'm at for the rest of my life. And then the next phrase that he wrote in his journal, and my hope is that you could say this tonight, is with Him anywhere. Without Christ, I won't take one more step. But with Christ, I will go anywhere He asks me to go. I'll do anything He asks me to do. David Livingstone understood that God is sovereign, which means He's in charge and He calls the shots. And Livingstone said, with God in my life, I will go anywhere. I'll do whatever He asks me to do. So tonight we're studying from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're going to take a look at this famous passage. In fact, if you heard the bird song, if you're old enough to be aware of this song sung by the birds, putting scripture to songs, this is the famous passage. Everything has a time. Everything has a season. If you're a fan of the UFC, you would recognize it from Bruce Buffer when he starts every fight with these words. It's time. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 1. And the first thing that the book of Ecclesiastes says is rely on Jesus at all times. Not just the good, not just the bad. Rely on Jesus during all times of your life. So the truth is, everybody in this room is probably in the midst of suffering right now. Or maybe stuff is going absolutely awesome for you right now, or you're somewhere in the middle. But everybody is in a season of life. And Ecclesiastes is saying, whatever season, good or bad season, turn to God, trust God, rely on Jesus during those seasons. Because there's nothing you can do to hit the fast forward button and skip to the end of this season of life that you're in. You can't go back to the good old days, rewind back to the good old days and relive that old season of life again. You're at where you're at. It is what it is. But you can at least learn from it and discover God's purpose in the midst of it. Listen to how this is worded. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, 1 and 2. For everything there is a season. A time for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to harvest. Now, I'm just going to be honest tonight for a second. If you have this really shallow view of God, if God is not, if you don't have this massive, expansive view of God, tonight is really going to upset your faith a little bit. And the word that's going to be difficult for all of us to deal with if you have this narrow view of God is the word everything. Yeah, most of us have this idea that God is a good God, and so life is supposed to be good when I belong to God. But the real problem is when life starts to get rough, and it doesn't get better, it only gets worse. Bible pastor Tommy Nelson made this statement. For 2 chapters in the book of Ecclesiastes, the writer of this book, a guy by the name of Solomon, is painting this picture, life without Jesus, and he says over and over and over again for 2 chapters, it's meaningless. It's empty. It leaves you wanting more. But starting today, God shows up in the equation. And then here's what Tommy Nelson says. Now that God is in the equation, you have an even bigger problem to deal with. Because God is in the equation, why does stuff go wrong? How is it that when I give it all over to God, it doesn't get better? It only gets worse. And the truth is, there are seasons that we don't even understand. Sometimes they're good, it's all going great. Sometimes it's miserable and it's getting worse. And every season of life, God either causes directly to happen to you, good and bad, or He at least allows it to happen to you. And if you've got this small faith, tonight is going to be a challenge for you. I want you to know, there's a church here in town that has a billboard sign in front of it that says right now, trusting in God means trusting in God's timing. Not just trusting in God's plan and the stuff that happens to you, but trusting in the time that God chooses to cause it to happen to you. And here's, church, I want you to hear tonight. This is why God allows the good and the bad. Every season of life is ultimately for God's glory. So that when things are going good, God gets the glory. When things are going bad, He strengthens you, He develops you, but He still gets the glory. In every season of your life, God is supposed to get the glory. But secondly, this is going to be hard for us to understand from time to time. Every season of life, even when it's rough, is also for your ultimate good. This is what Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, that God alone is big enough to take even the rough stuff of life and turn it around and use it for your ultimate good. Listen to these words, ultimate good. I didn't say immediate good. I didn't say that He's going to immediately make things good. Maybe it doesn't get better. Maybe it only gets worse. But ultimately, God uses it for your good and for His glory. And Ecclesiastes uses this example. Nothing is better in life. For a couple who's married, nothing brings more joy, nothing makes them happier than when a new baby comes into the family. I mean, that's about as good as it's ever going to get. And perhaps nothing is worse on a person than when somebody that you love passes away. And He uses these two extremes. There's a time to be born and a time to die. And God uses both of those for His glory and for our ultimate good. So the first thing I want you to know is rely on Jesus during all the times, every time of your life. Next 2 verses, I want you to run. Listen to this. Run. Don't walk to Jesus during the pain. Let's say that things are going really, really bad in your life right now. And the bottom has dropped out and it's not getting any better. And I want you to think about this as like a gardening analogy tonight. Let's say that you've taken the time and you've prepared the soil and you planted this seed hoping that you're going to get this bountiful crop somewhere down the road at the end of harvest season. You've given it all that you've got. And no matter how hard you try, stuff doesn't get better. It only gets worse. Instead of getting this healthy sapling, what you get is dried and wilted and miserable. And you're thinking, I don't understand. This isn't fair. I gave it everything that I could give it. When tough times happen, Don't wait until late in the game and say, maybe I should pray about this. Maybe I should give this over to God. No, don't walk. Run to Jesus when stuff starts to get hard. And pour out your heart to him. Tell him you're miserable. He's big enough to handle it. He can take it. Ecclesiastes 3, verse 3 and 4. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to cry and a time to laugh. A time to grieve and a time to dance. Do you see that Solomon, the guy who wrote this, is dealing with extremes here? He says there's a time where you help people's lives get better. Actually, when he uses the word phrase here, he's talking about spiritual. When he uses the word health in this phrase, he's talking about spiritual health. There are some times where God makes things better for you deep down on the inside, even if they're going bad on the outside. But there are some times where it's just getting worse, where you feel like you're dying on the inside. It says there's a time to build up, a time to tear down. And then he uses the idea of crying and laughing. And I try to think about it this way. Nobody is laughing at a funeral. There's a time to grieve and to pour your heart out in pain. Nobody's dancing at a funeral. But most people don't grieve at a wedding. Most people dance at a wedding. Now, you can grieve at a wedding, I guess, depending on who's getting married and who they're marrying. But there's a season for everybody, and there's a season for everything in life. And God is big enough that he's never confused, never caught off guard by what's happening to you right now. So I want to put you to this. I want to put you to this test. If you had to choose, there is no middle ground. You have to choose one of these two options. Which do you choose? A life of ease and pleasure where everything goes the way that you hope it would go. In fact, it goes better than you hoped it would go. But in the equation, there is no God, there is no Jesus. Or would you take a life of suffering and a life of difficulty if in the midst of it, Jesus was right there with you and you felt his presence? There is no middle ground. You have to choose one of the two. Which of the two do you choose? Ease and plenty, but no Jesus, or suffering and difficulty, but you get Jesus' presence and you get all of Jesus in the midst of it. Because the truth is, most people's faith is like a muscle. And that muscle only gets stronger when you really have to work it. Which means when it really gets hard and you're really struggling, that's when the muscle grows. That's when the faith gets stronger. That's when your relationship with Jesus is deeper than it ever was before, because it's miserable. And you're trusting in him like you've never trusted in him before. So run to him during the midst of the pain. But at the same time, I want you to remember Jesus during the prosperity. I want to give you some encouraging news if you're struggling or suffering right now. It's a season. Maybe it lasts for a while, but it's a season nonetheless, and it will one day be over with. But let me give you some discouraging news if things going great for you right now. It's also a season. And perhaps the season's coming to an end real soon, and the bottom is about to drop out for you. Every point in life, every period of life is a season. The pain and the prosperity. And the danger for most of us, if we were honest, is we tend to forget God when stuff goes good. Oh, we remember him really well when it's bad, and we need him really bad. But when everything is going well, when we're bringing in the harvest and man, it looks awesome, we tend to forget that he even existed or that he had anything to do with how well things are going around us. So listen to these two verses, verses 5 and 6 from Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to turn away. A time to search and a time to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. Now, that first phrase there in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 5, we don't really know exactly what he means by this. It could be a reference to fighting. Back in Solomon's day, when he wrote these passages, often when men would get into a fight, they would pick up stones and literally throw stones at each other. And so you were you're gathering stones so that you could prepare for a fight. Or sometimes if you hated your neighbor and you were mad at him because you're a farmer and he's a farmer, you would throw stones in his field at night during the planting season. And as hard as he tried to plant the field, he would get up in the morning and have to gather the stones and get rid of them so that he could continue to plant the field. Maybe that's what he's referring to here. But some of the ancient rabbis who read this said, no, actually this is a reference to sex. And sometimes when you're young and virile, you're going to have these raging sex hormones, and when you get older, those hormones are gone, and the desire for sex is no longer there. In either case, there's a season for one and a season for the other. And then he uses the idea of embracing, and this is the idea of grabbing a hold of something and not letting it go. And the truth is, if we had a choice, most of us would grab hold of the good times and never let them go. But don't forget, they're a season, they're temporary, they don't last forever. So don't make the mistake of thinking that everything that's awesome in your life happened because of you. Don't also make the mistake of thinking that everything that's awful in your life happened as a result of God. Maybe it's the result of your sin or the sin of somebody else that you care deeply about that's causing the awful stuff that's happening in your life. But you can work on that soil as hard as you want. You can cultivate it. You can plant it. You can fertilize it. You can nurture it and pull the weeds and do your best to try to make that soil produce a crop. But you cannot turn a seed into a plant. You cannot turn a seed into fruit. I don't know if you can see this here. There's actually 2 tomato seeds in the palm of my hand right here. And for maybe you folks that are on the front of the room, you might be able to see this little speck. But my guess is the rest of you can't even see anything in the palm of my hand. These are 2 tomato seeds. And try as hard as you might, nobody in this room can take these and turn them into this. Well, you can work the ground. You can put them in the ground. You can fertilize them. You can take good care of them. You can ensure that they get water. But you can't make the sunshine on them. You can't make this seed become this sapling, which will eventually become this plant. You can't do that. You can also take credit for those tomatoes. Work as hard as you might. Those tomatoes are the result of the miraculous hand of God taking these seeds and making them into a piece of fruit. And only God should get the credit for the awesome stuff that happens in your life. By the way, this is what the New Testament teaches in James chapter 1 verse 17 when he says, every good thing in your life comes from the Father above, the Father of lights. He gives every good and perfect gift. So remember Jesus during the prosperity. And really this whole sermon, from the potting or from the planting, the potting into the plant, and then to bringing in the produce, all of this sermon is leading up to this one point. Can you rest in Jesus no matter what period of life that you're in? Can you rest in Jesus and find peace? You know the reason why you spend all of that time preparing the ground and nurturing the plant and bringing in the tomato harvest? So that you can sit down in an easy chair and have a tomato sandwich and a glass of sweet tea and enjoy the fruit of your labor. Enjoy the gifts that God has given you. And you can find rest even in the midst of difficult times. Listen to these last 2 verses from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There is a time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and there's a time for peace. when he uses the word tear here, he's referring to your clothes. He's referring to you ripping violently your clothes. And when he says the idea of mending, it's the idea of sitting down in peace and doing some needlepoint. Now, he also says there's a time to cry and a time to speak, a time to speak and a time to be quiet. In Solomon's day, during a funeral, there were basically one of two types of people during a funeral. There were those people who sat down totally stunned, unable to speak because of the grief that they were going through in a funeral. And then it was often the custom in Solomon's day for the other type of person that they would literally rip their clothes at a funeral and that they would cry out to God. This is the idea of sitting in sackcloth and ashes. Solomon says there's a time for people to rip their clothes and to cry out to God and mourn. There are time for them to sit down in silence and stunned by the circumstances of life. And then he says, by the way, personally, there's a time to love and there's a time to hate. And he's talking not just about your actions here. He's talking about your attitude. Basically, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you're supposed to have the same kind of attitude that God has, which means you hate just like God hates. To the same degree that he hates, you hate the same things that he hates. The sin that's around us, the evil that people do to each other, you should hate it like a holy God hates it. And then he moves from the personal to the national. And he says there's a time for peace, of course, but there's also a time for war. There's a time for you to strap on your weapon and to go out and to fight for what you hold important. And maybe our founding fathers were paying attention to this when they said a nation that's not willing to fight and die for their freedom doesn't deserve it. Yeah, of course you want peace. And sometimes you're going to have to fight and go to war to preserve it. My brother, he's a little bit older than me. His name is Troy. He lives in Littleton, Colorado. He's lived there for many years. He came to faith in Christ later on in life. In fact, God gave me the privilege of leading him to faith in Christ as an adult. And not long after my brother Troy gave his life to Jesus Christ, on April 20th, 1999, two high school students went into Columbine High School and they murdered 13 students and wounded 20 more. You know this, Columbine High School, Littleton, Colorado. My brother was living in Littleton at the time. I tried desperately that night when I saw the news reports to get a hold of my brother, but the circuits on the switchboard were overwhelmed. I couldn't even get a call through to him. For 2 days, I repeatedly tried to call my brother Troy to find out how he's doing, how his wife is, how their two teenage daughters are. Are they okay? After 2 days, I figured because I didn't get a call from him, at least his daughters must be okay. But I continued to try to get a hold of him. Finally, I got him on the phone, and when I realized his daughters were okay. By the way, his wife, some of the folks that she works with lost their sons or daughters at Columbine High School. His daughters lost friends in this shooting. So by the time I finally got him on the phone, I had this desire to answer a burning question for him. A burning question that nobody at the time was even asking, let alone trying to answer. At this point, I was pretty sure that his family was okay, but now I was worried about his faith. And so I said, Troy, I'm guessing you're asking this question. Why didn't God stop it? I mean, the question is God big enough to stop it? And of course he is. So if he's big enough to stop it, why didn't he stop something like this from happening? I was really worried that my brother, who is a new believer, this was going to be the event that would cause him to turn his back and he would walk away from Jesus Christ. And he blew me away by the response. He said, Jeff, I don't know. But I do know that God is big enough that he could have stopped it. And he is still God and still good, even in the midst of this. This is before any news reports came out about stuff that actually happened during that shooting. And he said, Jeff, I'm not turning my back on him and I'm not walking away from him. I am proud to say that my brother is still following Christ today. And I thought this would be the event that would cause him to throw his hands up and to say, I can't worship a God who would let something like this happen. Now, I said at the beginning of this sermon tonight that God uses every event, even the tragic stuff, for His glory and for your ultimate good. Let me give you the supreme example of what I'm talking about. And this should give you the ability to rest in Jesus no matter what the circumstances of life. The greatest tragedy in all of human history is when an innocent man was murdered for somebody else's problem, somebody else's fault. When God's Son, Jesus Christ, left heaven and came to earth and lived a perfect, sinless life, put on display for the world to see. This is the kind of life that God expected people to have, that He created Adam and Eve to have in the garden. And since Adam and Eve, none of us have lived up to it. So Jesus lives this perfect example of what following God looks like. And in the process, religious leaders trump up some charges and they send him to trial, and he's eventually convicted and sentenced to die. And not just die perhaps one of the most brutal, excruciating deaths in human history. And God uses the greatest tragedy that's ever happened in human history for the greatest glory that He will ever receive. In fact, He uses it for the greatest good that will ever happen to you, because God takes your sin and He puts it on the back of His Son. And Jesus Christ settles once and for all your debt of sin with God by His death on the cross. Only a God who's big enough to take a tragedy like that and turn it around and use it for His glory and your good, only He would be big enough to take any circumstance that you're going through in life, whatever it is right now, and turn it around and use it for His glory. So my challenge for you is to have a picture of God that's big enough that you can sit in the easy chair and you can rest no matter what season of life you're in. The planting, or the preparing the soil, or the bringing in the produce. Can you rest with King Jesus no matter what you're going through in life right now? I want you to bow. I want to pray for you. And then after I get done praying, I want to ask you to worship Jesus by singing to Him in just a few moments. So bow your heads. Let me say a prayer for you right now. God, I'll be the first to admit, it's tough to trust You when stuff gets bad. But when those difficult times happen, and maybe some folks in this room are in a really rough season right now, would You cause us to run? Don't walk, but to run to You and rely completely on You and only in You, not on ourselves or not on our own strength. But God, it's equally dangerous for us to take the credit for the prosperity in our lives, for the good stuff that's going on in our life. Would You forgive us when we've taken the credit that You deserve? Would You forgive us when we've taken the credit for the awesome stuff in our life? God, would You forgive us when we haven't been able to trust You with the awful stuff in our life? And maybe somebody in this room tonight for the first time is realizing, you know what? I don't have that kind of faith. My faith isn't strong enough to say every season of life I can find peace. I can be at rest even when it's bad around me. Because I've never really totally turned it all over to Jesus Christ. And if that's the case, would You cause somebody right now, right where they're sitting, to surrender to Christ in the form of this very simple prayer? There's no magic words here, but if they mean it, this prayer will change not just their life, but their eternity. And the prayer goes like this: God, I am a sinner. I deserve what happened to Jesus on the cross 2,000 years ago. But I believe He left heaven, came to earth to die in my place. If it were only me, He would have went to the cross, and it would have cost Him just as much if it was for only me. So right here tonight, right where I'm sitting, God, this is just between me and You. I'm turning it all over to You. I'm trusting in you. And I'm saying, I will follow you wherever you ask me to go. And God, if that prayer is real, if it's sincere, then I know that you will be with them always. You'll never leave them. You'll never forsake them. And you will make them to become new people from the inside out. For the rest of us, God, would you give us the courageous faith that says, always, no matter what I'm going through, I'm relying on Jesus, not on myself. And in the process, would you help us to find that King Jesus is big enough to handle whatever we're going through right now. And I pray this in his name, for his glory. Amen.